joined a company called Monsanto back in the early 80s. And that was a time when there was a product called Roundup. And it was mainly used in vineyards and along roadsides, but very little in the broad acre market. So I'd spent first 20 or 12 years of the 23 years I was there working on the development of conservation tillage right across southern Australia. And then eventually I went on to work on the introduction of BT cotton, which is the first GM crop, and then led the introduction of GM canola or Roundup Ready canola until such time as the government's put the moratoriums on. And after that, it was sort of after 23 years, I thought it was time to move on. So for the last 18 years, I've been running a consulting business based just outside Melbourne, mainly focusing on commercialisation of new technologies, primarily new biotech crops. And I've been involved in as I was saying, cotton, canola, but also now working on safflower. But also I'm currently working on a range of other research projects related to new crops and new technologies. And my consulting work covers both Australia, private sector, public sector, but also internationally, doing work for companies as wide ranging as from Argentina to the US, doing some work in Europe and also in New Zealand. So pretty well much it's been a career sort of spent around new innovation. And I first got involved with super high oleic safflower nearly six years ago. And I'm just going to back up a bit. If my thing, sorry, just trying to get back up to the home slide. Yeah, there it is. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I started working on as a project super high oleic safflower back in 2015. And that's what I'd like to talk about tonight. As a crop, safflower was totally almost new to me. I ran a trial up at a place called Warwickville many years ago in my Monsanto days, where I actually planted some in a trial where I was planting about six different crops at the time under conservation tillage and seeing how they were performing. And that was my only exposure to it. And then in 2015, two guys here in Melbourne started up the company Go Resources for the specific reason of actually bringing this technology to market. I guess super high oleic technology is that it was developed by CSIRO as a result of the Crops by Factories initiative. And out of that came two crops. And the focus of that was to develop new high value crop opportunities for Australian grain growers. One crop was the omega-3 canola, which you may have heard of, that New Seed have and are developing. And the second crop was super high oleic safflower. And essentially, after evaluating a whole range of different crops to use their RNAi technology in, essentially safflower was selected for a range of reasons. What does the technology do? Well, essentially, in every litre of oil that's crushed and extruded from the plant or the seed, 90% of it is oleic acid. And along with that, because of the gene silencing of RNAi, you have very low levels of saturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids, and I'll show you that in a minute. So the nice thing about this technology when I first started with it was that it was Australian technology being brought to market by an Australian company funded by Australian grain growers. And having come from a multinational background and working on for various multinationals over the years, this is one thing I'm really proud of about this technology and this crop, that we can say it is truly a homegrown technology, and it's something that we're looking to take to the world. So what's so special about it? As I mentioned, if you look on the left-hand side, there's a range of high oleic crops that are actually out there in the marketplace, ranging from sunflower, soybeans, manola, which I had a bit to do with because in my time in Monsanto, I managed ag seed, which was the canola breeding business up in Horsham. But you've also got palm oil and normal safflower. And if you look at the bottom one, normal safflower oil, and you look at the oleic content, currently the normal safflower produces about 17% oleic amongst the range of fatty acids that are produced in the oil profile. And as you work up, you'll see that various crops can produce certainly higher levels of oleic. One of the things that happens though, when you start to produce higher levels of oleic through conventional breeding, and we certainly face this with manola, is that you actually lose yield and there is some level of instability. And so the level of oleic, even though it's been bred, is still subject to environmental influences, and you can get some yield penalty. The beauty of the CSIRO technology in RNAi is that consistently we get between 91 and 92%. I mean, it's that tight a range of oleic, and it doesn't impact on yield. So it's very stable, and I'll show you shortly where we've grown it, and that's very, very stable, that 91 to 92%. I'd also point out that if you go across the fatty acids, you look at linolenic, and you'll see 0%. So essentially what CSIRO have done is silence the genes that control linolenic expression and allowed the oleic of the genes that control oleic to overexpress. Why is that important, the 0%? Well, in the oleochemical industry, where this oil is being targeted, linolenic causes heat instability in oils. It causes it to go rancid. And so in the manufacturing industries where they use oleic acid, the first thing they've got to do is actually treat the oil and negate the linolenic. So from a manufacturing perspective, because this has got 0 linolenic in, what it gives the oleochemical industry is a step up start in terms of from a processing point of view. And that's really important as we develop different uses for it. On the right-hand side, the impact that linolenic, and one of the big advantages of the super high oleic you'll see is the heat stability. This is the number of hours that the oleic remains stable at 110 degrees C. As you can see, the super high oleic oil certainly outperforms all the other oils. As I mentioned, the oleochemical industry around the world, and this is where when CSIRO were developing this is where they were primarily targeting the oil. So it's industrial oil. It goes into multiple uses. Like industrial oil or fossil-based fuel oil, it can be fractionated and broken down into different components. And these components can go into a whole range of different markets. So there's a lot of products there you'll recognize that you perhaps don't realize that it's got an oleic acid base. And as I tell people, if anybody's got a heart pacemaker, that's got a very fine, highly valuable lubricant in it. That's based on oleic acid. And everything, if you look at telephone poles, they've got the black transformer boxes on them. They've got a lubricant to withstand heat. It's oleic acid base. So there's many, many markets, and the key to going forward for Go Resources and with CSIRO when we initially developed this is that we really want to focus on the high value in market, not the biofuel market or the commodity oil market, which are low value, but certainly the higher value lubricants. Eventually we could go into bioplastics. And the one exception which has occurred more recently, and even though we're not going into the commodity food market, there is a market that's being developed here in Australia. There's a company we're working with that sells really high value consumer oils. So they're selling the linseed oils, these really high value cooking oils. And that company approached us recently and said, we believe there's an opportunity in that high value end market. So we supported them in that, and they're now a customer. And so recently the first commercial product from our super high oleic oil has actually been released. It's called Heart Smart. This is from a company called Protoco. They're based up in Kingaroy. And if you go into Woolworths, you'll see it there on the shelves. Went on the shelves 2 weeks ago. Having used it in cooking here at home, I'd highly recommend it. It can withstand a lot higher temperatures and doesn't give you any abnormal tastes when you eat the food. But it's certainly, from our perspective, it's really key. It's only a second year of commercial crop growing, and we've already got a commercial product. But also, we've made a significant sale of oil to a company in India that's one of the third largest lubricant manufacturer, and they've taken a significant quantity. and it's landed in India. They've already started to process it. And they've come back to us in the last week and said, we want to sign up a long-term contract because of the quality of the oil. And we're working with a whole range of companies, the oil market, particularly the oleochemical, and particularly in the lubricant market where we're trying to focus initially. People don't change overnight as you appreciate. It takes probably a couple of years to get them to change over because they have to change over their whole manufacturing systems. But we've got companies like ADM in the US who we've been talking to and have come back to us after testing our oil, and they're really keen. And we have a number of other companies who we're talking to. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have had experience with safflower. It's a crop that was grown prior to canola. It was the preeminent crop, oilseed crop prior to canola. And in fact, talking to some of the early canola breeders, in fact, safflower was used as a benchmark for oil content and yield in the early development of the canola market. In a place like South Australia, there was a significant home for it down through the southeast. And there was a company down at Millicent, Seedex, who some of you may or may not recall, who processed, crushed the safflower oil that was grown through the southeast, and then sold oil. Unfortunately, they went out of business, and so safflower sort of went out of the market at the same time as canola was coming in. So it's really sat in abeyance for nearly 30 odd years. The only safflower that gets grown now is about 4,000 to 6,000 hectares a year for the birdseed market. The varieties, the conventional varieties, are very, very white seed, and that's what the birdseed market wants. But once that market's full, as you'd imagine, basically you can't sell the grain. And talking to a number of growers over the last few years since I've been working this, who have grown safflower for a long time now, they've said the issue with safflower is not being able to grow it, it's actually being able to sell it. And I spoke to a guy over in WA, Danny Esperance, last year. He was harvesting a 400 hectare paddock. He'd sold enough grain from 200 hectares, and he said, now I'm stuck with the rest. I don't know what to do with it because I've filled my contract. So that's the type of thing that you see with safflower. So this opportunity is really presenting, a high value market opportunity for grain growers, and hopefully you'll see that we've got some other benefits associated with agronomy, which a lot of people were, a lot of the old farmers who I talked to, and even some of their sons are aware of, but there's been no incentive for them to go back and start growing safflower again until now. As a crop for farmers, it provides a whole range of opportunities. It's an alternative, break crop in the rotation. You've got the canolas and the pulses, but this just provides another opportunity. One aspect of safflower which is attracting grower attention is the price stability. Where, for example, canola is keyed off the global soybean market, which can go up and down, and the price of canola can go up and down. With safflower, for example, we've had the same farm gate price we're going to our third year with the same farm gate price because we're keyed off the oleochemical industry, not the canola industry. From an agronomy point of view, farming systems point of view, probably the most encouraging aspect of this is when I first started on some of the agronomy work about 4 or 5 years ago. When doing the background research and talking to growers, is the comment about the potential role in sodic and saline soils. And if you go back through some of the literature, you'll see that safflower is actually regarded as being a moderately to having good tolerance on sodic and saline soils. And what we found was that in southern New South Wales, basically west of the Newell Highway and a lot of the sodic soils there, canola had really been failing, particularly in the dry years, because it hadn't been able to get its root system down through the sodic layer. And a couple of the consultants up there, together with John Kierkegaard from CSIRO, had been doing some work on utilising safflower and its big, deep taproot on some of those sodic soils. Traditionally, it's been regarded as a salvage crop. Most farmers would recognise it as being a crop that traditionally in a wet year, your wheat's failed or your barley's failed. Well, I'll come to spring, good subsoil moisture. I'll put safflower in as a good cash crop. So it's got that ability to be sown in spring. being a deep taproot, it's got the ability to break up soils. As I mentioned before, as an alternate crop. The other aspect of safflower is that it's regarded as being a semi-drought tolerant crop, primarily because of the deep taproot that can get down to subsoil moisture that most other crops cannot get into. And we've seen crops 2 years ago in a place called Medman, which is north of Temora. A farmer had 150 hectares of safflower on one side, 150 hectares of canola on the other side of the driveway. Didn't harvest the canola, but managed to get a half a ton of safflower off the other part of the paddock. And it can be probably one of the things that I've really come to appreciate with safflower and all my time in working in crops since the 80s, perhaps back in the 70s, is that I've never seen a single crop that can be grown over so many different environments. This is a map that I put together I was asked to look, for a talk last year, where can you grow safflower? And on all that, apart from South Australia and Western Australia, in all the other locations, we're actually currently growing safflower, albeit that in places like the Gilbert and the Atherton tables, they're really still at the development stage, so we're at the trial stage. But last year up on the Burdekin, up Mackay, we had some commercial crops. Northern New South Wales, again, has been like a traditional area where it used to be grown in rotation with cotton, primarily because after the cotton crop, the soil was very compacted. And then also too, they wanted to lower the water table because of irrigation. And there was up to about 25,000 hectares grown there originally. So, we've got farms there, starting to show that interest again to grow it as part of a cotton rotation. They've also got a whole range of sodic soils up there and saline soils once you get down to the Liverpool Plains. Southern Riverina I've talked about, and then in Victoria and Southeast South Australia being traditional grain growing areas. And I've also had a lot of interest out of the Eastern Wheat Belt in West Australia and also down around Esperance for farmers who, again, looking for an alternate break crop. They've got some sodic soils over there. And then finally, up at the Ord Rivers on the scheme up there, we've been growing our seed crops up there, and CSRI were doing trials there. So we've had nearly 7 years of safflower up there. So as you can see, from an environmental point of view, it's really dynamic. And interesting enough, we've actually, at the moment, we've only got one commercial variety that's been grown in all those regions. We will have more varieties as time goes on, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's certainly a crop with a great ability to go into a whole range of different environments. As I mentioned, the last 2 years have been our first 2 commercial years. Last year, 2019 was the first year. Of course, being a drought year was not necessarily the best year to try and introduce a new crop to farmers, but nevertheless, we had about 1,400 hectares planted, predominantly in southern New South Wales, and also some area in northern New South Wales. But this is just a map to give you an indication where we've been, doing the agronomy research, breeding research, seed production, and also the commercial crops that have gone. It's just to give you an idea, of the diversity of the environment. Probably what I'd like to focus on for the rest of the talk is really our R&D program, and to give you an insight into, as a company bringing a new technology and a new crop forward, what it actually entails. And we are in this unique position, as I said before. Safflower is regarded now really as a new crop. I find it really exciting because I've been involved in new technologies and new farming systems, but never a new crop until now, and not many people get that opportunity. While it's really exciting, on the other hand, it really presents a whole lot of challenges, not least of which is that there's basically been no investment. We started in 2015. There's been no real investment in safflower agronomy, keeping it up to date with, herbicides, fertilizers, and a whole range of, new technologies that farmers are using in, as normal part of their farming operations. Safflower had never been included. So we're faced with a situation where, our initial focus was plant breeding because there's been no plant breeding for 20 years. And so where we are with safflower is where the canola industry was 25 years ago. So when I started working at, running ag seed, the average oil content of canola was about 32%, 32.5%, and the yields were around about 1 to 1.5 tonnes per hectare. Well, interesting enough, that's exactly where we are right now. I'm saying we've only got one variety. So as a company, we saw our big, if we were with very limited dollars, we saw where we're going to get our biggest bang for our dollar, and we saw that in plant breeding, because we really want to accelerate oil content, yield, and a number of other characteristics that I'll talk about. So we initially invested $2 million in the accelerated breeding program, and that's still running now. And we're just about to go into our second phase of investment. From an agronomy point of view, while there had been some work done up in northern New South Wales by New South Wales DPI, there's certainly nothing done in Australia, southeastern Australia, and just basic things like time of seeding. As I said before, it's a crop. It's been regarded as a spring salvage crop in wet years, traditionally planted that August-October window. What we wanted to look at, because it was interesting, I spoke to a number of farmers who grow it, regularly, and they're planting in end of May, start of June, which was quite against the norm. But they were saying their attitude is they grow it not as a salvage crop, but actually as a crop for their rotation. So therefore they treat it accordingly. And they were getting 1.8 ton yields by planting at that time of the year. So we want to investigate that. The other thing about safflower is that a common comment is that when you plant at that time of the year, it's really slow to germinate and to establish. It's a crop that'll germinate and over winter it'll just sit as a rosette, and you don't see the spectacular growth like you get in canola, particularly hybrid canola. So we want to investigate that, and also management. From a management point of view, growers are saying to me, well, some wanted to plant early, some wanted to plant late to spread out their workload at that time of the year. And of course, ultimately, we want to see how all this impacted on yield. The second area of research we wanted to look at, and this has been, we've focused on this in the last couple of years, has been the role of safflower in crop rotations. Again, I had comments more from probably agronomists than farmers about, they believe that safflower would dry soils out and reduce the yield the following year, which contradicted a number of anecdotal comments we had from farmers who were saying, well, in fact, we have our best cereal crops the year after safflower. But when I went looking for trial data, there was no trial data to prove that. So we wanted to look at the impact on the following crop, and then look at we've actually got a study going now, which is looking at a 5-year rotation study, and saying, well, what's the impact over the rotation, not only on the following year. Another area of really focus has been the herbicide screens. If you look at how many herbicides were registered for safflower 3 years ago, you could probably count them on one hand. Since then, and I'll show you shortly, we've put a lot of investment into actually getting permits for a whole range of herbicides, because that was the biggest limiting factor that farmers identified, and particularly control of broadleaf weeds, hence the work on Brodel and Spinnaker. I'll quickly run you through each one of those areas of focus. From a breeding point of view, we have 5 major targets for our breeding program: reliability and yield and oil content, and there's a number of ways, of course, you can do that through your breeding program. Increase the harvest index and water use efficiency, which is important under dry conditions. Select parents for increased tolerance to saline and sodic soils. There was some work done that we initiated 3-4 years ago in Horsham in the Phenomics Centre, because through some field observations, we had reports of the tolerance of safflower to saline conditions. So we initiated a screen of 200 sessions of safflower from around the world to look at did the tolerance level change between varieties, and both in the glasshouse and in the field we proved that. And there is actually a paper, well, there's a number of papers going to be published later this year through Vic DPI researchers who did the work, looking at drought tolerance, saline tolerance, and a number of other areas that are associated with safflower. But certainly what we then did, once having that information, we then have now got in our selection criteria. Tolerance to saline and sodic soils has been part of the criteria for selecting parents. And we're already selected 25 that we've already started back crossing into the super oleic technology. Alternaria is the major disease, and we're always trying to build the resistance up for that. And also trying to add value to the meal and the trash Safflower meal is not as from a protein and feed point of view, is not as good as canola, but we are working with a couple of technologies at the moment, which we hope that in the long term will actually increase the value of those products. This is just showing you the work at Horsham in the Phenomics Centre. As I said, we tested 200 for the exotic and saline soil, but the group there have actually went through and over 3 years assessed 300 accessions as potential parents. This photo here probably summarises pretty adequately where our breeding program is. Stage 1, as you can see, the crop in the background, that's our current variety, E40R. Stage 2, we've got a cross that we inherited from CSIRO, which is the technology, the show technology crossed with a line out of the US called Montola 2003. That parent is Montola 2003 has been evaluated in over 30 locations here in Australia and consistently is generating 4 to 5% higher raw content and maintaining yield without increasing yield, but it's maintaining yield. So we'll be releasing the first lines of that in 2022-23. Stage 3 is the development of the lines from AgriBio with the parents, and stage 4 will actually be when our researchers are just starting work on this, is the development of a hybrid system for safflower. In addition to that, we've also got germplasm exchange agreements with 2 breeding programs in the US. One is based in Woodlands in California with a private company, and the one at Williston is the North Dakota State University. The breeder there is sort of the godfather of safflower breeding globally. He's been working on safflower for over 55 years. And that's just a shot of his research facility at Williston. I mentioned before about the time of seeding. One of the things we found, and it was more per chance, just observation than anything that drove this work, is that we had trials in a couple of locations where we had to plant over a 4-week period. And when we looked at the yields, we found this trend in yields, that the earlier we planted, the better the yield. I started then talking to John Kirkgard at CSIRO, who did all the initial work on bringing the planting date for canola back to April. And he'd been doing some work on safflower as well. And he was of the view that he believed we could bring safflower back. So we've been working on it since 2017, bringing those planting dates back. The trial we're using has got 4 planting dates between 7 and 10 days apart. This is just the yield data from last year. And as you can see across the trial sites, and you see where they're located, this is 2 so it wasn't a high yielding year, apart from Gundawindi. But you can see that yield trend. And so this sort of confirmed what we're seeing in 2017, 2018. And then this year we brought the planting date back. This is the Gundawindi site photo taken in October. This site only had 60 mils of growing season rainfall. And I should explain the site from last year on the left-hand side only had 50 mils of growing season rainfall. So to get over 2 tons dry land was just an amazing result, which supported the benefit of that taproot getting down into the subsoil. In the trials, what we did, we also put in the case of Gundawindi, we put in chickpeas because we wanted to turn this into a rotation trial. And in our trials in Southern Australia, we put in canola. And these are the harvest results from last year's trials. As you can see that, as you went north to south, the yields got lower, but that was more due to the available water that was there. But as you can see, we're still seeing that overall trend of early planting. Our aim was to plant in either the last week of April, first week of May, and then every 7 to 10 days. So you can see in 2 years worth of replicated data, we're actually getting that yield benefit of planting early. And certainly farmer observations, when we were getting farms to plant early this year or 2020, we were seeing the same results. Farmers planting in early May versus late May, early June, mid-June. You could just draw a line across, the response to yield. That also sort of addresses the question of where farmers traditionally see the role of safflower. and saying most people are really surprised when we say you can plant it in May, because they were brought up to believe it was a salvage crop. So part of the challenge here is actually working with growers and making them feel comfortable in planting a crop, one that most of them haven't grown before, or if they have, they've planted it in August. So there's a lot of hand holding going on here with growers, as they learn to grow the crop. The second area we wanted to work on was the rotation. You can see the photos here from 3 different locations. So we went back over the time of seeding trials last year, including the canola and the chickpea site in Gundawindi, and we planted wheat back on a couple of the sites and barley on a number of the sites to see what the impact was this year, or in 2020, I should say. So these are the yields from 2019. You can see up at Gundawindi, the safflower out yielded the chickpeas by almost over half a ton. Conversely, the canola down as further south you went, very clearly out yielded, being a hybrid canola, very clearly out yielded the safflower, which is what I would expect. Now, when we look at the yields this year, though, so I keep on saying this year, 2020. So this is the yields you can see at Gundawindi. We planted barley, and the barley on the chickpea has out yielded the barley on the safflower. But when you move to Southern Australia, where we're looking at wheat at Mara, wheat at Rutherglen, and barley at Kalkee, you can see that the actual barley and wheat has out yielded the barley and wheat on the canola stubbles. While I haven't got the stats there, probably the main takeaway here is that the first time of seeding from safflower last year was the highest yielding of the safflower timings, and this year it was also the highest yielding of the wheat and barley timings. What we're proposing to do here is we're going to run this site for 5 years. We'll go back into the same plots this year and plant probably pulses or whatever the farmers deem as being the normal part of their rotation, and then we'll run it for another 2 years after that. So we'll have a good 5-year study on the impact of safflower on the crop rotation. As I mentioned, one of the other challenges that we had was the herbicides. Because of the lack of herbicides. This is just a photo taken. We've been working on herbicide screens now for 4 years, but this is a photo taken up at Birchip, which is in the Southern Mallee, and probably on the edge of probably where I would have thought canola would grow. But you can just see here with this trial, the reason we looked at spinnaker and brodel is that we had farmers who'd actually sprayed brodel and told us about it afterwards, not being registered, of course, but they said it worked really, really well. And with spinnaker, we had the New South Wales DPI approached us last year, and what they were planning to put in a permit for spinnaker over the top of the safflower. Now, we'd already previously worked with spinnaker and we'd knocked it out. I mean, we'd already got rid of it because we knew it was going to cause crop damage. But being that they were going to, we said we weren't going to support it, but we still put it in our trials. And you can see here, I mean, this photo really tells the story of the trial. This is a really nice, a nice bit of work done by the Birchip Cropping Group. So what we use 3 rates. We use the lowest labelled rate, the highest labelled rate, and then twice the labelled rate to replicate headlands where farmers do double spraying. This is the phyto effect at an average of 27 days after application. As you can see, brodel does, and we know brodel did cause some minor phyto effect, but you can certainly see spinnaker here has really had an impact on the crop. And the rating was 1 was no effect, 9 was severe effect. So it's a really nice response curve. And then when it came to yield, what we saw in the photo and also in the previous table chart was reflected in the yields. And as you can see here with the brodel yields, there was no significant difference in any of the brodel yields versus untreated. And with spinnaker, of course, that's really knocked the crop around just confirmed our decision not to go ahead with it. So this year we'll be seeking from the APVMA a minor use permit for the use of Brodel. And why Brodel is really important is broadleaf weed control is probably the weakness in safflower in terms of herbicides. We have plenty of grass selectives. And over the years, we've had products like propyzamide, Secura, Boxer Gold, Jewel. We've done all the work and then had them registered for minor use permits in safflower. So, really there's a lot of work to be done. This year we're going to be focusing some additional work on plant nutrition because again, it's an area, being a small company, one of the challenges you have is that you only have finite dollars to invest. So you've got to really prioritize where you do your investment. And so in this case, not only did we see the need to invest in just variety development, which really is probably the scope of what you'd expect a company to be invested in. Our company, fortunately, our board has seen the value of actually investing in agronomy because we don't have anybody else investing in agronomy for safflower. Certainly, we'd like to see more investment from people like GRDC and others, but certainly that's the challenge. That's the challenge. That's the challenge we have. So that's really probably summarises where we've come from, where we're going, and where our focus is. Our plans for this year, we're looking to now, particularly with the South Australian government lifting the moratorium on GM crops. We've been encouraged by the South Australian government and by others to come back over to South Australia and start looking to develop the market over there for super high oleic safflower. And I'm already working with a number of people to help develop that. But certainly COVID-19, of course, has been a bit of a bugbear. But if it's any indication, the closest we've come to growing in South Australia, we grew a crop within 300 yards of the South Australian border 2 years ago on irrigation, which went 2 3/4 tons up near Francis, which was a bit challenging because we had to move it without crossing the border, the grain, which presented some challenges for the farmer at the time. But we're certainly looking forward now to expanding the opportunity in South Australia for South Australian growers and also working with researchers. I see Rhiannon's on the call with Sardi and so forth. And so Craig, that's pretty well much what I'd like to present tonight, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks, David. Much appreciated. We do have. I think you can hear me okay there, David?
Yeah. Yep.
Thanks, Butler. We've got a few questions from the floor. It was very comprehensive, but Peter, Greg?
Yeah, look, I was just wondering, David, about root diseases, Pradolepis, CCM, and the role of safflower in rotation. How plenty is the crop?
Yeah, it's a good question. I couldn't tell you directly about those particular diseases. I mean, diseases are not my area, root diseases, but there is some work that, and I'm happy to dig it up, where it does show that safflower has been effective in creating a break for some disease. I couldn't tell you offhand what they are, but that was certainly seen as being one of its benefits earlier on. But it's also something, again, I come back to what I was saying before about research. To be honest with you, there's a plethora of research that could be undertaken on this, and I'd encourage, if people have got interest, that it's an area that I'd encourage people to look at, not just root diseases, but in any areas of research, and certainly we'd be happy to help out wherever we could. So I'm happy to pull some information together, but I couldn't give you a definitive answer right now.
To help out that question, David, I have got a technical note, and we'll try and get that in the newsletter. I think it was Mark Stanley wrote a paper on, or a PIRSA fact sheet on safflower, and doesn't incorporate root disease in that. But more talks about Phytophthora and waterlogging. Do you want to make a comment on waterlogging tolerance?
Sorry, well, I can make a comment on Phytophthora. Is that what you're asking?
And waterlogging tolerance.
Yep. Oh, right. So waterlogging tolerance definitely doesn't like wet conditions earlier on. Absolutely. We saw some crops last year up around Bum Edmund, through that north of Temora. It got really, really wet. So a combination of planting late and wet conditions, we saw for the first time Phytophthora, and that really did affect the crop. Crops that were planted early and were able to get out of the ground and get established. We didn't, crops established in early May, mid-May, we didn't see the effects on. But certainly later crops, and the later they were, and with the up around Forbes, south of Forbes, we saw a couple of crops that really got affected by Phytophthora. And where we saw it really affected, and again, just for your benefit, where does safflower yield? What safflower has, it's like canola, it's indeterminate. So you'll get a crown of heads at the top, and that'll give you your base yield. But the real bonus yield comes from your secondaries that come up the root stem, the stem of the plant, and they emerge later. And if the plant is under stress, you won't see those emerge, or if they do, you'll see disease like Phytophthora take them out, and that's what we saw last year. We're actually at the moment we're looking at registering some fungicides. On safflower. I haven't got the list with me. My colleague is looking after that, but Phytophthora, can be a problem. A really good reference for safflower, there's two really good references I'd suggest. One of them is GRDC in their grow notes do have a grow notes on safflower. Now, the majority of the information there is actually being generated for Northern Australia. So just be cognizant of that. But the other book is, and you can get it online through GRDC, it was published in 2010 for the International Safflower Conference, which was held in Wagga, and it's called Raising the Bar with Safflower. That is like a Bible for me. It's got some really good farmer case studies, but it's also got some really good agronomy research there and agronomy tips. So I would certainly use that. We give that to every grower as a reference document for growing. And in both those documents, they address root diseases, foliar diseases, stem diseases, and so forth. So, and they are saying they've got a whole range of farmer case studies, which I'd highly recommend reading.
On the case studies there, David, we've got a question from Richard on the Zoom. Have you got indicative returns for growers? Any in the last 2 years?
Yeah, good question. So 2019 was far from being indicative because of the drought. Last year we had, so in 2019, the yields we had ranged from 0.3 of a tonne up to about 1.6. Up around Warwick, Nabil, Horsham, we had a couple of crops where we had late thunderstorms and they're able to take advantage of it. We had 1.6 tonnes, but it really didn't give us any indicative gross margins. We do have some early gross margin data from 2020, which I'm in the process of collecting. And certainly, so just so you know, the farm gate price for safflower is $650 a tonne. That's what we're paying farmers at the farm gate. And the yields last year that we've got so far, and we've still got more yields to come in, have ranged from about 0.5, 0.6 up to 1.8 tonnes. But more of the yields this year have been in the 1 to 1.3 tonnes. I haven't got any final gross margins yet that I can provide you, but I'm certainly happy to because we're trying to collect them off as many growers as we can.
Thanks, David. Another comment here was about the herbicide tolerance, and historically, Ally, Glen were products that were used, and Diron was also mentioned. You got any comment on those existing herbicides?
Yeah. So Diron and Ally are both registered for safflower. Ally you can use up to 10 grams per hectare, which surprised a lot of people about its tolerance. In our screening, we've actually looked at a whole range of SU herbicides, Turbine, and it's a Trizone. But we have looked at a range of the SUs, and we found Ally to be the safest. I mean, Glen, I do know of farmers who have used Glen in the past, but because of resistance, a lot of people are not that happy to use it. So we haven't pursued any registration work with it. But certainly aloe is a herbicide that gets used quite frequently now on our safflower. You've also got, as I mentioned before, you've got a range of grass selectives you can use as well. Plus we've got the residuals like Sakura, propyzamide, and so forth. So yeah, there is a range of herbicides available now.
No worries. So have you got labelling for propyzamide and Sakura, or just that internal work, or have you got a permit?
We've got the permit in. We're waiting on the AVPMA. What they've come back with us is they actually want us to get. We've actually got to go back to the parent company in Japan and get some data, and we're in the process of getting that at the moment.
That's right. I'll pass on maybe Rob Wheeler. Got a question here.
Any effort going into Roundup Ready tolerance or things like that are currently in?
Yeah, good question, Rob. To be honest with you, no. And the primary reason is dollars. To start a program like that would cost significant dollars. I said the company is a small Melbourne-based company, and trying to get investment is really, really difficult at the moment. And it's a nice, we've thought about, and again, been asked often about SU tolerance and IMI tolerance and, triazines and so forth. There's all got potential, particularly, but it's a case of just where you put your priority dollars. And at the moment, we're just not in a position to do that. But not to say it hasn't been written up on the wish list, but it's, if I had a choice, there's many other things like hybrids, which I think would be, from an investment point of view and from a grower point of view, would be a lot more better. And to be honest with you, given my background with working on Roundup for so many years and Roundup Ready canola, I don't think we need another Roundup Ready crop in the system. I think we already abuse glyphosate enough. And certainly some things that are happening with glyphosate, which I would have never even.
I think the IMI tolerance, not the IMI, the IMI tolerance is probably the easiest one maybe to tackle. You've got a group not far from you in Horsham there that actually produce IMI tolerant varieties of a number of crops quite easily and simply. And
I actually had a conversation with them about 18 months ago. I actually know some of the people there, so no, we've had the conversation, but again, it just comes down to priorities at the moment. So, but yeah, that it's on the list, but we're just not there yet.
Another question is nutrition-wise, is it as hungry for nitrogen as what canola is?
No, interesting enough, when you read the literature on plant nutrition, it certainly responds to urea as a foliar herbicide. If you apply too much nitrogen at planting, you can get toxicity to the seed. So we're sort of recommending to use, at the moment, and this is based on farmer experience, to use the sort of the levels of nutrition you'd used for wheat to start the crop off with, and then come in with foliar urea later on. The other nutrient it responds to is zinc. We've seen in the field, we saw some literature which suggested that zinc would be beneficial to safflower, particularly with oil content and yield. And we had some growers last year try it, and their observation from the field was that where they left strips without it, there was definitely a response to it. So that's why this year we're moving away from some of the historical agronomy work, and we're moving into plant nutrition, where we think there's some real opportunities, particularly with some of the new fertilizers that are around at the moment. But certainly you can cause some level of toxicity to safflower. It is covered in the, if it's not in the grow notes, then I think there's comments on it in the Raising the Bar with Safflower document.
I think that'd be great. Yeah.
What was the risk of shedding mature seed at harvest time with wind or other factors in comparison with canola or chickpeas, whatever?
Yeah, good question. We certainly haven't had any shattering problems at all over the years and over all those locations. As you probably, you may or may not realise, but it'll always be the last crop that farmers harvest. In fact, one of the complaints I'm getting from people is that they have to, somebody has to hang back to harvest the safflower rather than be on holidays. But no, I mean, that photo in front of you there, that was taken up at Birchip. When we looked, I was actually on the head of that day, and we went back and walked over the ground to see if we could find any grain on the ground, and there was just not a grain on the ground at all. One of the because of the capsule that the seed is held in, it's held pretty tight, so it doesn't come out very easily. And so we haven't seen any shattering problems at all, nor have we seen any lodging at all either. And we get all our trials are assessed for lodging and for shatter. So if we're going to see it, we haven't seen it yet. One of the I was talking to a researcher in South Australia last week actually, and one of the interests he has in the crop is the potential, because it flowers later, it could be a crop that could overcome some late season frost issues as well. And while we're talking about the seed head, one of the questions I get often is, what about birds? For those of you who've held a safflower head, you'll know that it's very, very spiny. For those who haven't, I'd recommend you don't, because you'll end up with just spines in your hand. What we've seen with birds is that they'll attack the outside 2 or 3 rows because they can push the plants over and get to the seed heads, because birds love the cedar cores, but they won't go any further than that because they can't push the heads over or the plants over. In northern New South Wales, farmers have actually used it in the past as a deterrent for kangaroos and for wild pigs, because they won't go through the crop because of the spines.
Chris Butler's got a question here for you, Dave.
What's the main contaminant? Peas, beans,
Yeah, good question. So oil purity is our really, really critical for our end product. The crops that will cause problems for this are anything that can produce oil, anything that can produce a fatty acid of any quantity. So volunteer canola, I actually have seen. I've seen, we had one crop 2 years ago that had volunteer faba beans in it that had to be cleaned. The faba beans had to be cleaned out of it. And I mean, but most crops like that you can overcome with in-crop weed control. The faba bean ones was interesting because the farmers wanted to plant supply there the next year, and of course didn't want. When I said to them to use alloy earlier on, they didn't want to use alloy. So in the end, they were penalised because they had to, pay for cleaning of the faba beans out of the safflower. But it's any crop that volunteer crop that can produce a fatty acid that would potentially dilute. As I mentioned before, that 92% volume of oleic is really, really important when we come to sell the product on spec. And more importantly is zero linolenic. So we can't afford, we can dilute the oleic, because of the volume, but the linolenic we can't dilute so significantly. So, but we haven't had any problems so far, touch wood. So hence the crop actually is sold in a closed loop system, and that's why we talk about the farm gate price, because at the moment we work with growers. We will pick the grain up off the farm, and it goes directly to Temora, where it goes into a designated safflower silo.
So in respect to that, did you just mention you're crushing at Temora? Is that the only crush you've got? Or where are you crushing?
No, sorry. So at the moment it's being stored in Temora. The last 2 years it's been crushed. Some's been crushed up at Kingaroy, and it's a critical volume question around where it gets crushed, because the big crushers like Cargill's of the world, they're happy to crush it, but you need to have the minimum volume to go through that because of the size of their plants and efficiencies. So we've been using a crusher originally in the first year at Kingaroy, and last year we used a crusher at Wagga. We hope that once we start to get our volumes up, that will then start to move into using people like Cargill for crushing, and that could potentially be in Footscray or in Newcastle. There is a new crushing plant being built down at Millicent, and we actually have been in discussions with the people there as well, because obviously if we can grow the crop in the southeast or mid-north or anywhere in South Australia, then carting it to Millicent and having it crushed there was obviously, the economics are a lot better. And I should make the point, the only product that we export or sell is actually oil. We don't sell any grain at all. And there's a whole range of reasons behind that. But not least of which is that it actually keeps the whole supply chain clean of any potential grain contamination. So yeah, oil is the product that we sell.
So I've got two questions based on that oil. There was a question from Rob Blum there on Zoom. How does the economics of the SHO safflower oil compare to palm and soy based oil or canola oil on the world market?
Yep. So yeah, good question. So at the moment, we're competitive with both those products or those other types of oils. And just to reiterate, probably the big advantage that the feedback we're getting from customers is this, the value of, well, they're getting more oleic per ton of what they buy. So because of the 91, 92% oleic content. More importantly though, they've got a processing saving, an economic saving, because they're not having to take the linolenic out. So from a value point of view, we're getting really positive feedback. The challenge is that for them to change over their systems just takes time. And so, but having said that, we've certainly got demand ahead of us. I mean, we've already forward sold most of this year's crop, already sold last year's crop, and it's, it looks like it's just going to keep moving from there.
So do farmers get paid an oil bonus like canola, 42%? Or?
At the moment, we don't. Because we only have one variety. Certainly what the intention is, and I go back to our breeding program, that when we start to look at releasing our next variety, which is a 4 to 5% higher oil content on average, we do have the opportunity to change the way we do business. And certainly, what we want to buy is tons of oil rather than tons of grain. So from our perspective, paying for oil content is really, that's a real opportunity for the future. And, we've spoken to a few growers about that concept. It may not be bonification as we know it now with canola, but certainly the concept of buying tons of oil at the farm gate is something that when we've bounced a couple of ideas off growers, they like the idea.
What's the finite demand? 100,000 hectares, a million hectares?
Good question. So to give you an idea, I'll start sort of where we're at right now. The two companies that we've got signed up on contracts, the one in India and the one here in Australia, the numbers they've given us tell us that they want the equivalent of 60,000 hectares, 60,000 planted hectares a year in Australia to service just their two contracts. And that's without anybody else coming in. Our target in Australia is 100 to 120,000 hectares. Where it goes from there really is dependent on the adoption in the market. As I said before, we've got a designated person in the company whose sole job it is to work with the customer end. He's got a PhD in the oleochemical space. He knows their language, he knows their products, and he's just working globally because we've got interest. We've sent samples to Europe, we've sent them to Asia, to the US. We've also got customers here in Australia. So really, the demand, where will the demand be? Well, we're talking 100 to 120,000 hectares on what we know, but 60,000 hectares is just two customers already. So that probably gives you an idea. Optimistically, I'd like to think it's better than that, but I'm really wary out of experience in giving any forecasts.
All right, that's fine. The last question I'm going to ask is access to the technology. So have you got providers accredited in South Australia, or what's the process for farmers to be able to get a go at it?
So at the moment, we're in the process of setting up those arrangements for access. If anybody's interested, they can contact me direct initially. But by the time, hopefully in about 4 to 6 weeks, we'll actually have those arrangements. We'll be announcing what those arrangements are for South Australia. And the point I'd make is that the critical thing in the first year is that and we've done this since we started, and we've done it purposely, is that we're looking for sort of locations. If we can get a group of growers in a location, and the reason is that when we start, and it comes down to cost, when we start carting grain, the further we've got to cart it, the more expensive it is. Now we're trying to address that by having more localized delivery sites. But again, it just comes down to having a critical mass. And certainly, early indications are, from a few growers I've spoken to, we've got a group down through the southeast. Looks like a group up in the mid-north who are interested and can provide us those areas to focus on. Not to say we wouldn't entertain anybody. So sure, I would. It's just a case of being realistic about management of the grain, particularly at harvest.
Very good, thanks, David. I think we've exhausted the questions from home and in-house here. So thank you very much for your time. We'll provide some contact details through our next newsletter next month. We'll try and get a summary article from you as well to put in the newsletter if we can. But if everyone in-house can give a warm thanks, David.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So we'll have a short break here for an internal conversation. We didn't have it before because it's just Rob and I. It would have been a little bit embarrassing having that question and answer session in-house, but I'm just going to grab the screen back.
Yeah, Craig, I was just about to say you better take it back before I exit.
Yeah. The screen. It was up there before, now I can't find it. Oh, here we go. Thanks, David. Thanks. Yeah, look at the modern technology we've got now, Chris. So we have an internal question time. So that's where those come inside. Yep.
Glad there's a young bloke up the back. Reduces our revenue.
The average age is looking pretty bad. Thanks, Carl. So current issues at the moment, out of the back, Tim Harris, what's the issue out there at the moment?
I'm still got a steel bleach nightshade and that's the main one shade, correct?
Yep.
And then a few little weeds, 3 or 4 millimeters long 2 days ago, so they won't go away. Right.
That's right, another generation of cow. So, Rob Wheeler, any news from the industry for you?
I just saw a message today that Roundup resistant capeweed identified in Western Australia. That's a bit of a worry.
Okay. Yeah.
The first Roundup resistant capeweed in the country. In fact, it might be in the world.
In the
world. Yeah.
The capeweed is resistant very early.
I use Roundup on the capeweed all the time, so I'm bugging.
You'll have to start using Lontra or something stupid on your own, won't you? Not that you're allowed to do that because it's not registered. So
Roundup safer and easier.
Doesn't do that harm energy. As far as some industry information, there's been some ongoing activities still within the industry from the planning point of view, but we haven't had a meeting recently since before Christmas. Peter Grogan's had difficult time in respect to a council process with an approval next door that we've been helping through. So I don't know if there's an update on that, Peter. Or...
Yeah, look, basically, I applied with various support letters to the National Farmers Federation to get involved because the planning aspects for rural have been more both state and nationally, and the implications Australia-wide. Obviously, those that read the Weekly Times, there was articles just recently in the last few weeks about some of the Victorian examples there. I guess now the National Farmers Federation corresponded with me yesterday, and they have gone before their executive committee only the day before, and they've decided not to give any physical assistance in my specific case, but they are willing to write all the sporting letters, and that was Livestock SA, PPSA, GPSA, Crop Science, John Daly, Brokenshire, and John Lush, being a previous SAF president. And they're acknowledging, they've promised to acknowledge formally that rural planning scenarios are of critical importance, both state and nationally. And they believe there will be able to be some policy upgrades nationally and state-wise. So I guess the benefit would be that if National Farmers Federation keep their promise and do write this letter of detailed interpretation of the matter and say it's a national significant matter, that should actually give impetus for state government to sort some of these issues out. So Honourable John Daly met with Vicky Chapman on the Pacific matter. The previous Wednesday, he met with David Basham, Minister for Prime Ministries, this week on the matter. So obviously government's aware that there are serious deficiencies. It's a matter whether it's palatable to act quickly or not. So I'm not quite sure on the government's attitude. And the Planning Commission has been horribly slow.
Communication channels through the Planning Commission is slow, but very poor at the moment. It's been not much since December. So, yep.
So there's nearly what you could say is a reluctance to actually give feedback or any actions. And we don't quite know why the Planning Commission is so slow and tedious. They've given basically lack of support from government, which is possibly the cause, or is it due to problems internally in the Planning Commission? So there's obviously big problems there.
And there is problems not just for Peter, but I had another chat this evening with John Lush. I caught up with on the way here, and there's ongoing issues with that council area as well, and the southeast and the lower Air Peninsula. So it's not an isolated issue; it's a statewide issue. On other industry matters, there was another presentation for GRDC update on chemical use and residues and the issue around market access. So there's some key messages there. Use labelled products at the right rate on the right crop and the right timing. Residues are being picked up at this stage. It's not having a direct impact on growers, but it's having a direct impact on markets. And there have been ships turned around that had to be redirected because of the issues. So the industry is actively working on that. Viterra test individual samples plus holds and consignments, and the industry has the National Residue Survey that presented to us. So we know that is ongoing, but just be mindful that there are some particular headaches out there on the number of chemicals.
They give an indication which chemicals, which crops, correct?
IMI chemistry across all crops has been flagged as a particular issue. So they already had it flagged with barley because of the South Korea and the Japan situation. They had already, following that, flagged wheat, and are in the process of doing that, and in the subsequent time has flagged lentils as a particular issue, and we have flagged fava beans as the same issue. So there's some issues around timing, rate, and right product on all of those crops, and plant back, because you've got residues coming through on stuff that has been applied to crops. And I know Peter Cuzzy was holding that a couple of years ago. You're getting residue levels showing up in follow crops as well. So, yep, Chris.
I had a chat to David Keach, the R&D guy of the new farm that Intercept, and he said the indication he gets is most people, or too many farmers, are leaving their post-emergent application way too late, and he would like to see it brought back to the 5 or 6 leaf stage of the lentils. So way back before a lot of guys are actually using it, and that will obviously help with dilution through the system, breakdown. The other thing I had this week was a pH map out of Kim Hanson's machine that just showed a very large section of the paddock, probably about a third, was down at 4.5 pH. and IMIs are not going to break down in that particularly well at all.
You're also going to have significant nutritional issues at that lower pH, where your efficiency of nitrogen and phosphorus are going to be.
But then you get lower yielding. If you planted lentils there and didn't know, you get lower yielding lentils, which is a higher concentration of IMIs as well, more available per lentils.
And it is an important point you raised. I'm glad you said that, Chris, because that's one of the factors in the rescue is poor yielding crops. You know, somewhat droughted crops that maybe they thought we're going to go 1.5 to 2 tonne and end up under a tonne of hectare. Of course, there's a greater concentration in there. And the testing has changed as well. So they're not doing the whole grain extracted with a liquid process. They're grinding the sample. That is extracting more. The chemical is in that grain and they're just able to extract a higher concentration, which is another problem as well. Because we're getting levels that are not just 1.5 or 2 times. We're getting much higher than that in a single application. Right. So, but timing is a very good message, Chris. And I reiterate that to everyone. We were too late this year by the time we knew with lentils. We had an issue, but next year definitely make sure everyone is early. Don't wait for the weeds to come up. Just go and spray early. So.
And new farm won't be reached century in lentils, which is unfortunate because it's pre-emergent.
Yeah.
To give us a little bit safer margin.
Question on the chat. Thank you. To Chris. Does that mean Chris speak up?
Or does it mean Chris speak up?
How little rain can you get with century for post-century for southern Durham in 2021? What rainfall would you require after using century? I assume it's pre-emergent to grow Durham. Well, I would have said that's 300 mils, 250 or 300 mils. But it depends if it's acid or not. If it's acid, you probably need to add another 100 mils to that.
If it's acid, don't grow Durham.
Yep. And there are issues around, yes, I was a pre-emergent application made. And there are issues around pre-sowing applications and burying that chemical in the interrow, and then that interrow not getting wet up properly and not break the chemical down the same rate as when you put on after seeding and it ends up washing down in that furrow. So just bear in mind that has happened in my situation. It's quite dramatic. pH 8.5. So you're not got a pH issue there, but you've probably got a nutritional issue that could also inhibit breakdown if it's a very alkaline soil and it dries rapidly on the topsoil. You won't actually get the microbial activity like you do on some soils where it holds the moisture close to the surface. I have seen that on those sort of soils as well. So I'd be very wary about that.
8.5 has a link problem straight up anyway.
Yeah, so other nutrition, phosphorus tie up as well, and zinc nutrition. Yep.
So going back to those residue issues, India is one of the ones we flagged as well with that one.
So the issue with India is that they don't have a lot of MRLs established. So they just have blank, they have blanks,
yeah, blanks.
Which means what applies is a 0.
That's what
it's
I
not 0.01, and if they can test a parts per trillion, then that's what you've got to
so
get 0 down
has India raised an
level
issue
of detection. No, but that market does consume the lentils. Now, they could choose to say that does not meet the standard, and therefore they could reject it. But at this stage, they haven't rejected them. Be mindful they have the opportunity to if they.
So wasn't the story that Bangladesh was taking up all lentils now rather than India? One of the sellers I was hearing that they're trying to convert lentils away from India.
There was an issue there pre-January, pre-Christmas, regarding the Indian tariffs. And so but that's relieved now because India said we're not changing the situation. I believe it's relieved now. Yeah. All right, unless there's any other in-house issues. There's been a few questions about Russian wheat aphid management at this stage. If you've got areas that the green ridge that carries through, then aphids could be a particular problem. So I wouldn't rule out a seed dressing at this stage. I don't know what your thoughts are, Tim, on that.
Well, the bloke from saying it, so you shouldn't use any seed dressing. But I think anyone with any acreage really has to look at it because it is going to get around to doing it.
Yep, so it becomes a management issue.
There is a midpoint, and that is having some seed dressing insecticide home on farm. And if there is an early rain in late March or early April, and you end up with a fair bit of green material, you can then treat your own seed as you need it, rather than just a wholesale seed treatment. And what I found last year was the barley, which was sown later, even though it's more susceptible, didn't get infested as much as the early sown wheat, where the aphid could jump off the volunteer barley grass and other grasses around the area.
And that again was reiterated last year in environments where that knockdown occurred immediately at seeding with a very low level of volunteer cereals. It wasn't considered necessary to go into a knockdown beforehand, but a low level of plants, there's enough to carry those aphids over. Those plants die down, the aphids jump straight off on the emerging crop. So that is the same as green peach aphid, isn't it? Exactly the same. You have volunteer broadleaf plants or broadleaf weeds and into canola, and you have that same problem with green peach aphid.
And don't let the buying of imidacloprid, if you think you want to go to mid type or even treat seed now, make the decision and go and get it, because order it up. Because with the situation in the eastern states and some of Victoria, who knows what's going to happen.
We're talking about the eastern states. One last point is the mouse bait situation. So they've got crops coming to maturity, quite a bad mouse situation happening over there. If you think you're going to have a mouse situation on your farm, then you need to order up as well, because you won't get enough tech to make the mouse bait that you will require later on.
Are there any people in our area with mouse?
We've got low numbers and high activity. So they are quite active in their holes, but there's not high density in the paddocks. So
what about where are you seeing this?
Central York Peninsula, low wind losses with wheat and lower mid north. Yep.
So there was a San Remo 30-year celebration on the weekend, and there was discussions around durum and basically comparing with red wheat. The discussion revolved around durum is probably suffering a yield penalty of something like a tonne a hectare on the best wheat varieties of good seasons. Years ago, that gap wasn't so pronounced. Basically, with the susceptibility of durum for dry finishes and frost
And crown rot.
How does everyone feel what the price premium's got to be to grow durum against the best red wheats as far as your reward against risk? Is 70 to 90 bucks a fair figure, or is
What's
it
the current wheat price today? What could you sell wheat for today?
or 307, 310, whatever?
Yep. And what is the current offering on the durum contract?
I got to find that out. Yeah.
I heard it was nearly 400. So
I thought I had 4 in front of it. Or
so that's $80 odd a tonne premium if you work on those numbers. I think it's actually a little bit less than that. I think it's probably like $75, $80 premium. Is that enough? Would it be enough for your country, Tim?
No, we've got no encouragement.
No, how about there? In your country, you probably would do
It'd
it.
be pretty close, isn't it?
And certainly there are growers interested in that, given they can secure quite a high price at the moment.
Yeah.
Uncertain
Bit of security.
price. And it's an area-based contract, so it doesn't matter whether you produce 2 tonne or 6 tonne.
Yeah, the problem is I'm not sure whether they've sorted out the frost risk. So therefore,
Well, you've still got those other issues. If you have a half-tonne crop because it's frosted, they will let you cut it for hay. But if it's going to go 2.5 or 3 tonne, it should have gone 6.
Yeah.
And it was frosted, you have to read that.
have to read it. So have they defined that in writing, in the contract?
You can ask for that.
That's what I need to ask for, because I just don't want to read 2 tonne frosted wheat, frosted durum.
There might be other experience from those at home. There's actually someone's made a comment there.
So Craig, you're on
390 San Remo, yep.
Okay, beautiful, thank you.
on the crown rot issue, Syngenta will release, I think it's now 2023.
Right.
New active ingredient.
Yeah, new active for that, and that's looking very, very promising.
We might even try, we're building a speaker base for next month, and Rob, whether you are over March 17th, write a presentation for the group. He's not shaking his head, so that must be a no. And we're going to take some young organisations, we might look to get Syngenta into maybe so they can provide some Timerian work, because it's not just crown rot, it's Pratolangus as well.
Right.
And it was 60% yield increase in a couple of sites again. So very, very high yield in. And that's where on wheat during on high crown concentration. Yeah, there's some really good work on compatibility of rates required for that.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be a good game changer. good as what they're saying.
And it won't see that, so the yield advantage of that level of effectiveness in Europe. We probably also find people using it in breadwheat and barley in high risk situations. There's a lot of barley affected by that dry July last year,
Yes.
and tillers died off. So there's for that. So
if you want to see the effect of crown roll on durum versus breadwheat, have a look at the NDT results for Pastorville last year. It's actually the quarantine trial report. The trial wasn't good enough to be good enough to be released. Not crown roll devastation, but crown roll was absolutely.
so Pastorville wheat, compare that to the Pastorville durum, and you'll see the variation.
It's in the quarantine trial report. And you'll see the two side by side, they're in the same conditions. Effective ground loss, just there you go.
Right, so that's really good conversation. We might just break from that to our next speaker to come on. Rob, you're on mute at the moment. I'll just do a quick introduction. Rob Blum's a new member of Crop Science Society last year, so he approached the group to have an opportunity to speak, and he's been zooming in to meetings. But Rob's going to provide a presentation on the development of plant proteins, and obviously involved in a particular plant protein, but he's also going to provide a bit of an overview of the industry that's out there, because it is a very big growing industry. I think it's a $40 million investment in Hudson for the protein extraction plant over there. There's major developments in Canada, not just extraction, but also breeding for high protein extract favour beans. So this is a market specific for things like protein shakes and drinks, energy drinks, etc., that have a protein content. So there's development in that. Without any further ado, I'll pass over to Rob.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for having me. And so a quick intro about me. So I'm an entrepreneur. I'm not a scientist. First of all, I'm an engineer, very curious engineer, but my focus has in my career has been in business. So I'm bringing a lot of the science that is backing our business, but we're here also to exchange ideas and to hear your questions. And so so let me start by introducing the team, who we are. So I spoke a bit about me. So I grew up in Brazil, went to engineering school in Brazil and France, lived there for a bit in France. Then I transitioned to, I started working as an engineer, then transitioned to finance and did a lot of food and agriculture finance in Brazil. Fern, who is my business partner, and she's here watching the presentation as well. She's an engineer, electrical engineer from Melbourne Uni, with an MBA and large experience in product and marketing in Australia and abroad. And who helped us a lot with the science is Rod McDonald, who joined the company early on as a science advisor. From New Zealand, Rod is an engineer and has done lots of work and research with leaf proteins and other crop processing systems. So the problem we're trying to solve is basically how to feed our world in a sustainable way. So first, the first information that I'm going to bring here is the amount of protein that is consumed in our world. So protein, there's a lot of interest in protein because it's linked to building muscle mass and strength. And we in fact consume a lot more protein than we need. We only need 50 grams per day, and most developed countries consume over 100 grams. So in fact, we're over consuming protein. Protein from animal sources are, of course, very negative for the environment because of the feed to product conversion ratio. So these figures might seem very high. These are on a dry matter basis. So if you get in terms of dry matter from beef, for example, you need 25 times the same mass in terms of grains of feeds, plant feeds, to produce that same mass of dry matter in beef. So that generates, in fact, lots of greenhouse gases. So this is causing the climate change that we all know. So we see that even with a recent increased awareness and consumers looking for more sustainable foods, animal protein is growing, still particularly pulled by developing nations like China and India. But there is a growing interest, and consumers are becoming more aware of the environmental impacts of our foods and are switching to more sustainable foods. So this is creating a strong pressure in the market. Companies are looking for new ingredients and developing foods with more sustainable proteins. And in fact, when we look at the market of plant-based proteins, there is only 4 main protein ingredients that are dominant in the market, which are soy, wheat, rice, and pulses, particularly pea. These products, they add up to around 80% of the market or more. And we know, of course, they're annual crops. So they have, we continue to trim our native vegetations to expand the areas to produce those crops, as well as for feed and for nutrition, human nutrition, of course. And they have many other problems like intolerances, allergies, GMO that some people decide to avoid as well. So companies are looking for other options to develop plant-based food ingredients, foods that are appealing to consumers and they need other ingredients. So that has been confirmed to us. All of the companies we talked to, they're interested. So the Nestle's and Danones of the world, they're all confirming their interest in such ingredients. So as a result of this, there's been a lot of interest from investors as well. Last year was a record year in terms of investments in alternative proteins. And the largest part of it is in plant-based foods. This is over $1 billion in the first half of 2020. So talking a bit about grains versus leaves. So of course, we all know that the main sources of protein today are grains. And so here is a comparison of grains and leaves. So grains compared to leaves have a low yield. So leaves produce lots of protein per hectare, so very, very high yields. The carbon balance is also negative in grains because you can capture more carbon, particularly with perennial plants, if you produce leaf protein. In terms of nutrition, grains, they will contain more protein, oil, and starches, while leaves contain protein, fiber, and minerals, so different composition. Lifespan of grains is long because they're stable. As soon as they become mature, they can be stocked for a long time, transported, and then processed later, while leaves, they have a short lifetime. And then the cost for grains is low, and for processing leaves is high as a consequence of this. In terms of nutrition, comparing then soy with Pereski aculeata, which is the plant we are using. So if we look to the first and last column, we see soy will have about 36% protein, and Pereski aculeata 28% protein in terms of dry matter. What's interesting is that the leaves, they contain about 90% of moisture. So it's a big mass, big volume to be processed. So our solution to this problem is, so how can we, yes?
Yeah, sorry, question from the floor was the common name or the,
But the common name for the
Common
plant
name
you were
for the
describing as in the second column? Ciliata?
Yes, sorry. Can you repeat, please?
common name for the plant?
Oh, common name is, so in English it's Barbados gooseberry, or here in Australia it's known as leaf cactus.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. So we're trying then to feed the, develop a new protein ingredients that is sustainable. Our solution is to develop technology to unlock the most abundant source of protein in our planet's green leaves. So that's a little unknown fact. So leaf proteins, a bit of the research and history about this domain area. The pioneer of leaf protein research is a man named Norman Pyrie. He started studying these leaves as a source of human nutrition around the Second World War and after in the UK. Then around the 70s and 80s, there was a growing interest in the US, backed by USDA. In the 80s, New Zealand invested a lot in partnership with European companies as well. So lots of leafy greens have been surveyed and processes have been developed. And then the technology matured around leaf protein extraction technology matured around the late 80s. Rod McDonald, our scientist advisor, he was involved. He has a patent in this area. And then around the 90s and 2000s, the interest died down because most of the solutions were not very interesting in taste. They had both taste and appearance, a strong color and a strong green color, and a bitter taste, so not very palatable. So the interest from consumers was not very common. And then in the most recently in the late 2000s, there's a new cluster that has been formed in terms of research. In Europe, particularly in the Netherlands has become the new center of research for leaf proteins with Wageningen University, and lots of companies are being launched most recently, researching all sorts of plants. So from lucerne to water aquatic plants like duckweed, and we started researching a cactus plant, the leaf cactus, or Peresca quillata. In terms of technology, so the extraction processes, this is all available in the public domain. So this is a survey. Basically, the process is not very complex. Then, of course, every plant is going to be different. You basically have to pulp and extract the juice. So there's a first step, which is separating the juice from the fiber contents of the green leaves. So you're pressing the leaf somehow to break the structure of the cells, and then after you process that through thermocoagulation or some other source of sort of precipitation methods to coagulate the protein, and then you filter the solids to separate that from the residue. So this is a simple process. There's lots of research around this. Then the main technical challenges around producing leaf proteins are, of course, still taste and color, extraction yield. So the yield has not been increased significantly. So from all of the protein contained in the leaves, the best processes can achieve up to 50% extraction. and also anti-nutritional compounds still present, in addition to fiber, of course. Our solution is Pereschia culeata. So what is this plant? Pereschia is a native plant from Brazil, where I'm from. It's a highly nutritious leafy green vegetable that is a traditional and celebrated food in Brazil. It's been consumed for centuries, and it's consumed as a produce or cooked in salads in varying dishes in Brazil. It's a regional food, in fact, and I heard about this plant and started researching, cooking, and developing, experimenting with it. And what's interesting about Pereschia is a combination of factors that make it an attractive plant for protein extraction. So first, it's a plant that is quite neutral in taste, so that facilitates the process of producing a final protein extract that is also palatable. It's a plant that has a very high yield, and it's a cactus species as well. So this is a plant that is very efficient in terms of use of natural resources. And finally, it's a mucilage rich plant. So that seemed interesting for us, because it's not a plant that it's technical to solve. So we had to face some technical challenges to separate the protein from the fiber because of the mucilage. So that's something that attracted us as well. The Pereschia culeata basically grows in subtropical and tropical Brazil and in America. So it's present, in fact, from all the way from Argentina into the United States. It's not very common in other regions. It's quite common in the Brazilian semi-arid. So and it's a plant that was wild until 2016. Then because of research raised attention from industry about some of course the nutrition and some other compounds contained in the plants. There is a growing interest from the scientific community, so lots of papers coming out about Pereschia culeata most recently. Comparing Pereschia with other protein crops, it's quite impressive, the protein yield per hectare. So it can produce up to 2.5 tons of protein per hectare compared to soybean, for example. It's twice as much. And in terms of water needs, it's quite efficient as well. So it can grow in areas that are in the Brazilian semi-arid, for example. In terms of products, as Craig said, so our focus is more in the B2B ingredients market. So we're developing protein ingredients that have varying applications. So it can be used for the nutritional components of the ingredients, such as a protein concentrate, and it can also be used for the functional ingredients, such as an emulsifier, to create structure in foods. In terms of product roadmap, so we, of course, Pereschia powder is quite simple, is just drying and milling the product. The leaves, Pereschia emulsifier and protein are two products that we developed in lab scale. And Pereschia protein 80% is a product we have in our pipeline of research. In terms of traction, yeah, we had lots of interest from food companies in Australia and in Europe, in the US. So yes, it's clear their interest in new in new protein ingredients that can allow them to create differentiated products that can be marketed as more sustainable. And then, of course, the business model. We started initially working with a plan to develop farming of Pereskia, and then we would buy from those farmers and commercialize to companies. So we would focus on the processing. In terms of competition, as I mentioned, the plant-based proteins ingredient is basically is dominated by soy that has about over 60% market share, and pea, wheat, and rice are the main ingredients. Okay, so now some of the challenges that we have faced in terms of, so the main challenge we faced so far is how to scale up supply of Pereskia to produce our ingredients at market competitive prices. Farming and processing Pereskia. So Pereskia, as I mentioned, was wild until 2016. Until Embrapa, the Brazilian Research Corporation, developed a growing system for Pereskia. So basically, they came from picture on the left to the picture in the middle. So basically, created a low density system to farm Pereskia. The industry today is nascent. So there is less than 100 hectares. It's most farmers are smallholders that are experimenting with this crop, and the focus is to produce fresh leaves, of course. So it's low density layouts and also very manual processes. When we saw and observed this system, we said, yeah, that's not viable. We need to develop something better. So we started researching and learning from the tea industry. So basically, comparing both systems, we said, all right, we can probably develop a high density system for Pereskia. That seems viable. We also studied processes, so automation processes for the tea industry, and it seems quite viable to develop for Pereskia as well. Yep. Sorry, there are questions.
Yes, so we were looking at adaptation. How low a rainfall can you go given it's subtropical and tropical?
Sorry, Craig, can you repeat, please?
How low can the rainfall be?
Yes.
How far is it adapted?
Yes. So we have not experimented with with the limits of the plant, right? To confirm that to you. So Embrapa said that they've grown Pereskia in regions that have around 600 millimeters a year. As long as it's not concentrated, that works. But they've not experimented much with stress.
And does that need to receive that rain all year round, or can it go through a dry, warm period?
Yeah. Yeah. So the recommendation is to have at least 8 months of rain. Then in the dry period, in general, the dry period is going to be when the plant is not harvested, right? So basically, in the cold period, it's cold and dry, and then in the warm period, when the plant grows, it's where the rainfall is coming. Okay. More learnings from the tea industry. So here are some of the challenges that's the main challenge that we're facing in the moment. Is basically the main constraints we learned from the tea industry is that leaf processing is only works in vertically integrated model. So basically you need to have your processing plants very close to the fields, particularly because of the high volume and weight that needs to be transported. Also because of the short lifespan of the leaves. So you need to basically harvest and process the leaves right after. They can only be stored for a few hours. Also, automation has limitations, even in fully automated farms. The number of full-time equivalent employees per hectare is not very low. So we visited a farm that required 0.4 FTEs per hectare. So that cost is still significant compared to other crops. And in the end, adding up the farming and processing costs of leafy greens, that adds up to around $6 to $8 per kilogram of dry matter. So in the end, that cost is quite significant still.
Rob, could you harvest it, dry it on site, package it in big square bales, take it to the factory and then reprocess it from a dried material?
Yeah, so we are not aware of a process to extract the protein from dry leaves today. That can be researched, but yeah, we're not aware of that. Then in terms of next steps, so our current focus, so the main conclusion is that based on the tea harvesting processes, we came to the conclusion that harvesting and processing bushes is expensive. So given the low cost of current protein ingredients such as soy and pea, soy protein concentrates cost around $2 per kilogram and pea cost around $5 per kilogram. If we look at, for example, tea costs between $6 and $10 per kilogram for the whole leaf. If you extract what is not protein there, this cost is going to go up. So from this study, we came to the conclusion that either we need to change the focus from bush to other leafy greens that can be automated, that can increase efficiency of harvesting, or we need to develop a better process to harvest and process those leaves. So this is our current focus today. And yeah, this would be it. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
We do have questions. So on that extraction of dry product, would you expect a lower extraction rate out of a dried product that was reconstituted?
Yeah. So in fact, that's a good question. To be honest, I don't know, because probably we would need to reconstitute the plant to reprocess, because the process we are using today basically is pressing the leaves to extract the juice, and then extracting the protein from that juice. So we use the liquids, we use the water that is contained in the plant. If we dry them, I think it's going to add up another step, because we need to use energy to extract the water and then transport and store it, and then rehydrate and to process it again.
So how far have you got on the investigation of other plant options? I presume, you know, the Australian native legume trees, wattles and acacias and the like, you've investigated, haven't you?
Yeah, so we have a pipeline of other plants. Moringa, for example, is not a native plant, but is a source of protein. Some companies are researching. Pongamia is another plant that is being researched. Acacia is another plant. Well, these are all trees, so they also have the same problem of picking. So quite expensive as well. Pongamia is a plant that is being produced in the United States. There is a company called Terra Viva that is quite advanced, and they developed a vertically integrated system, and they've developed processes and machinery and tooling to be efficient to harvest the tree. Most of the research with other perennials has been done with lucerne, which is a plant that is quite easy to harvest. So as of now, we are looking for grasses such as lucerne or other grasses that can be harvested using existing automation.
I see your colleague Fern's put some comments up there about the extraction processes out of Germany, and they can extract out of most things, and that also saltbush is being investigated. But so just to go back on that lucerne one, so you can extract it from any high protein leaf, and it won't matter if it's wet or dry, you'll be able to extract it out of that.
Yes. Yes.
Where the devil's lucerne.
So what about seaweed?
That's a different type of plant.
Sorry, Fern?
That's a different type of plant. That's a sea plant. So the processes will be a little bit different.
It's still protein, but I bet there'd be protein in the seaweed or not?
Yeah, absolutely. Seaweed's very, very high in protein. I mean, spirulina, as one of the protein supplements, is obviously known for its protein. I did want to actually come back on the point around lucerne, because I think it's in Keith. There are a number of lucerne growers in South Australia. So we'd be really keen to speak to anyone who is a lucerne grower that would be interested in this, to see what their interest might be.
You know, so it's not only in the Keith area, though they have the biggest, I think they're the biggest lucerne seed producers in Australia and probably the world. In terms of locality, there's lucerne throughout the mid-north as well. Hoover area is always a big lucerne area. So, and New South Wales as well. So,
Victoria.
Yeah, and I presume annual crops as well. So,
Why not take wheat? We can't manage.
So Chris wants you to take Lowry and Rigidum annual ryegrass. Can you take the protein out of that? Because as soon as you make a weed valuable, it's no longer a weed anymore. That's right. No, that's right. Lowry and Rigidum.
Most of Pigra. Yeah, that's one of the biggest environmental weeds in Australia.
Is that the maintain? No.
That's right. Marshmallow. Oh, egg grass.
Yeah.
Marshmallow, which is Malaparty. All right, I think we might have exhausted the questions in the house, and there's no more on the text message there. But everyone can put their hands together for Rob and Fern, please. One of those non-crop topics, but with the plant protein business globally growing extremely rapidly, it's interesting to see the other approaches rather than whole grains processing, and obviously meat is certainly a growing market. Starting from a small base, the protein plant-based.
Can we just throw in a question? It's just come to my mind.
Peter's got a question.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. You know, fava beans, they grow beautifully in wet seasons. You might have them, 1.6 meters high, massive foliage. So if you could actually
Undecided.
Christopher, no, we got good resistances on these. So say we got this beautiful fava bean, massive foliage, and you could cut it with a mower whack it into some
Big
storage,
square bales.
big square bales, cool store it, whatever you need to do, but it'd be a beautiful lot of leaf material to utilise. I can just imagine some gross margins there with tonnage.
Especially if it's full of weeds. So I think we'll further that conversation, but and we've got Rob and Fern's contacts, so we'll try and get something in the next newsletter if we can, Rob.
Fantastic.
No, I think we've done the thank you, so very good. If there's nothing further, and next meeting is next month on the 17th as well. So we'll hopefully have Rob Wheeler presenting. We're going to have to drag him back in for that one because I think I've nominated him before. And we'll try and get some of those chemical questions dealt with, maybe Gary and on time Miriam from Syngenta, and hopefully we might get some of the other chemical suppliers of the newer products, Overwatch and Maxamax that have been Maxamax last year. And Callisto, yeah.
And Terra.
Yeah, so the range of new products. So we'll try and get an array of people to come along, and we'll probably have a bit of it as an agronomy forum, I think. So. But we'll leave up definitely with the major speaker being Rob Wheeler. So, all right, well, thanks very much everyone for their attendance again. Good evening.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Guys.
Thank you.